that, let's get started. I'm really excited about this one. I think we've got some great content up here. We've got two excellent speakers. First, we have Christine Porvaichuk. She is the Chief Commercial Officer of Cellplan Technologies, where she specializes in assisting the utility market on telecommunications network implementation, providing guidance on the selection of technology and spectrum, design and optimization of networks. And then we have Bob Finch to my left. Bob is the president and founder of Select Spectrum, which provides FCC spectrum license consulting, marketing, and brokerage services. Christine's going to go first. We can take questions after Christine's presentation and through Bob's if we want to have more discussion at that point. Is that okay, Christine?
Can everyone hear me well? Okay. So I would like to start when Bob invited me to do this presentation with him, and it was like 4G and 5G networks and the applications that you can use 4G and 5G for. I decided to start by trying to analyze if I were choosing a spectrum band, what would be the things I would have to consider? So my first slide is really, what are the main factors when you're talking about a network design that would force you to think, what spectrum band am I going to use? So I started by the most known that everybody thinks of is path loss or the attenuation suffered by the spectrum bands. So higher frequency are more likely to be absorbed by propagation medium because you have shorter wavelength. So what ends up happening is that you translating it on day-to-day speak is it doesn't go as far. In reality, it attenuates more, but the effect is the same. You don't have a coverage that goes, or service area that goes as far when you're working with higher frequency bands. When you're working with lower frequency bands, you have longer wavelengths, you propagate, you attenuate less, so your coverage, yes, it does goes farther, but your interference also does. So everything, like everything else in life, there's pros and cons for everything, and there's pros and cons of going farther and staying closer. So it's important for you to understand, and I will emphasize this over and over and over, what is the application you're trying to serve? Because that ultimately will dictate what you're trying to cover, okay? So that's in terms of path loss. And then there's a second consideration that a lot of people forget, which is your throughput or your queuing and polling requirements. So just give an example. Let's say you have 1 million meters and you need to read each meter once a month. So now you have 1 month to take readings of 1 million meters. You can probably do it with any technology in any frequency band because you're not in a hurry. Now, if I give you the same 1 million meters and I say you need to poll every single meter within 5 minutes, now it's a whole different scenario because things change. So it's important for you to understand what your network is trying to serve because that ties directly with the spectrum. Why? Because of the bandwidth. So on the first bullet point, I'm talking about the band of the spectrum. Is it 700, 900, 1.6? On the second bullet, I'm talking about the bandwidth you have on that spectrum. Do you have 1 megahertz, 3 megahertz, 5 megahertz? If you have more spectrum bandwidth, one of the things you can do with this is send bigger chunks of data at once. So if you have a throughput-hungry application, for example, video surveillance cameras for facial recognition, you need to send big blocks of image with a certain data rate. You will need higher, bigger spectrum bandwidth for that. Now, with more spectrum, you also can transmit more things at the same time. Just say like, oh, I don't want to do, a big surveillance camera, high frame rate. I want to do something a lot smaller, but I need to do a bunch of it at the same time. So think of my meter example. I need to do 1 million meters in 5 minutes. So that is another type of demand. So you have the throughput hungry and you have many devices having to be transmitting at the same time. And then the other one, the last bullet, It's actually a combination. Is what happens a lot of times is you're very happy today, you don't have a network, and you're very happy getting information from a device once a week when whoever goes there reads that device. As soon as you can get that information wirelessly, it's like, oh, maybe I should get it every 5 minutes. Or you just significantly increased the throughput of that device. So if that's your goal, that's what you have to consider when you're choosing your spectrum, because that will dictate how much capacity you need. And then the bottom bullet, it's actually a mix of the top two, but it's where are your devices located? You know, are they fixed? Are they mobile? Do you have a little bit of both? Are they concentrated in little areas? Are they spread everywhere? And why is that important? Because if you have a bunch of devices, you see one thing that I say over and over is like, put your tower close to your devices. Well, that's easy to do if your devices are all clustered in one specific area. Then you put your tower there, you're close to the devices. But what if you have two here, two there, two there? You're not going to put one tower to serve two devices. That makes no sense. So then you have to cover a much wider area. So that device distribution is something also important to keep in mind. So what I tried to do here is I got, and I know there's some people from SRP here who will recognize that area because it's in Phoenix. I just tried to find an area where I have worked, so I was familiar a little bit with the type of terrain that was there. And I wanted to put a site that had one sector a little more urban, one sector a little more rural, like not many obstructions, and then one. So the sector to the top is more rural, and then to the right is like a suburban, but a fairly dense suburban. And then to the third sector has a little bit of like buildings and also kind of like a more urban mix. And here's just to show you the clutter. That's exact same area, just to show it's 5-meter resolution clutter. So it has enough detail for me to show the predictions. Then I included this slide about application requirements. There's one particular reason why I included this slide. This is from an IEEE paper. It might be about 10 years old, 9 years old right now. But the reason I put it there is because this is a generic slide based on the research these people did for the applications at the time. I can tell you that this will be different for every single utility here because of everything I said before. How often you poll, what you're trying to poll, what you're trying to do with that data, it will all affect this throughput demand here. At the same time, this is the hardest thing for me to obtain from every utility here. Every time I asked this, I was like, why do you need to know this? And I see other people laughing there because they know how hard it is to get this. But this is one of the most important things for you. If you're trying to choose a spectrum, you need to know what you're trying to provide with your network. If you don't know this, you're making an uninformed decision, okay? So what I'm going to do now, I have 2 slides. I'm going to talk about 4 bands of spectrum, 700, 900, 1.6, and 3.5 gigahertz. I have 2 slides for each. One slide is like a few bullet points to remind me of some stuff I need to talk about for the bands. And then the next slide is a prediction on that area, the cell that I pointed out in Phoenix. So first one, let's talk about the upper 700 megahertz A block. Well, the name of this session is 4G and 5G networks. So in 700 A block, I only have 1 megahertz of spectrum bandwidth. The only type of 4G that I can fit in there is narrowband IoT, okay? Each narrowband IoT channel, it's about 200 kilohertz. 180 kilohertz is actually the useful part of it, but it's 200 kilohertz channel. You could fit 1 or more within the 1 megahertz. Narrowband IoT is ideal for applications that have low demand. So we're talking about small data throughput and no stringent latency requirements. Why do I say that? Because this technology, it really thrives, and kind of jumping out of order here a little bit, sorry about that, but on the longer battery life that it provides to the devices. So it is a type of technology that it's meant to serve things that are very far from the tower. So it's a wide area, and it doesn't use high modulation schemes. So it uses QPSK and BPSK. So I don't know how familiar you are with modulation schemes. Shameful plug, if you're not, read my article in the journal, I talk about them. But you want to be on the highest modulation you can. So QPSK is not a high modulation. It doesn't give you a lot of throughput at the same time. But you know what it gives you? The condition to go really far. It gives you range. So narrowband IoT, it will do certain modulations that will get to repeat the information, the same information, 17 times. What happens when you repeat something 17 times? You accumulate all that signal. You can go much farther and you can still understand it, but it takes longer. So the latency of narrowband IoT can be an issue, especially if you're really far from the cell. And that's why you see latency from 1.6 to 10 seconds. You're like, whoa, that's a lot of difference. Well, yeah, because if you're really close to the cell, you're not repeating, you're just sending information. But if you're in the very edge of the cell, you are repeating that a bunch of times. Okay, so the number of repetitions or your bit error rate, meaning your signal is not as good, or the volume of devices that you have to transmit, you might have to queue because you only have a little bit of channel to work at a time. So you can't transmit them all at once. You cannot do 4G and 5G under the narrowband IoT. You can't do 4G and 5G, not because of the band limitation, but because of the bandwidth. You only have 1 megahertz to work with. Example application, smart metering, smart lighting, sensors. So those are all types of applications that could tolerate that extra latency. And a lot of times you're having to reach really far. So I put here, and I will start the explanation of this slide with a big caveat. I tossed about the idea a little, and then I settled to stay how it is now. We're going to talk about 4 bands. And I said one of the things I'm going to compare is the propagation on the 4 bands. So if I don't compare apples with apples with apples with apples, you can't really compare. So I had to settle on one configuration of site and end device, and then I stuck with that on all my plots. So the site that I'm using is a 65 feet high site, directional antenna. The endpoints that I chose, so every prediction is in relation or respect to a certain type of device. So the device that I chose is a 15-foot device, again, with a directional antenna. For a narrowband IoT, though, if you're thinking of a smart metering type of application, you're probably going to be lower and you're probably going to be omni. But if I did that, it would completely lose the comparison factor of the propagation on the band. So all 4 bands are going to be using this exact same scenario with one added observation. For narrowband IoT, I'm showing their RSSI, which is the signal level for the whole 200 kilohertz channel. And the squares that you see there, they're about 10 by 10 miles. On the other ones, because the coverage is much smaller, you see that the square size would be 2 by 2 miles. And I'm going to be showing our SRP because then we're talking about 4G and 5G. Okay? So you can see even on narrowband IoT, the rural goes a lot farther. You have a lot stronger signal propagating a lot or going a lot farther than the suburban and urban. Oops. Then the next band, band 106, the 900 band, we have 3 megahertz FDD that you can fit narrowband IoT or 4G LTE. For 3 megahertz, there is no 5G yet. I do believe Anterix, as Bob can confirm that later, has applied with the 3GPP to be able to do 5G in a 3 megahertz channel, but as of now, it's not yet. It's ideal for applications that do not require high peak throughput. So the peak throughput is something very important to understand. It's very, let's call it a marketing number. When you're talking about peak throughput, the first thing is that you need to define your assumptions. You will see peak throughput values in every LTE or 5G paper you read for all different bands. And you see that depending on who's writing what, that peak throughput values will change. Why is that? The band is the same, the bandwidth is the same. Why is it changing? Because it depends on your assumptions. So for example, if you go every time the 3GPP releases a new release 17, release 18, release, 199 of LTE, what they're going to do, they want to market the technology. So what are they going to do? They're going to say, if we were not using guard bands, if we're not transmitting the reference signal, if we're not doing this, if you could transmit a peak throughput of XYZ, okay? So I tried to use a throughput calculator, and if anybody's curious, just let me know later. I'll give you the website I used. But to do a semi-realistic, so still not considering a lot of overhead, but not considering MIMO, just considering the channel size and the usual transmission, okay? When I also talk about peak throughput, you have to understand that that word peak indicates you would be giving your whole frame to one specific device. That's what peak throughput is. That does not mean that if I say you have a peak throughput of 15 down, 15 up megabits per second, doesn't mean that every single user is getting that. That means that that is the most you could ever give to a user. And why is that is important? Because the closer you are to the center of the cell, the higher the throughput you're going to have. As you go farther from the center of the cell, you're going to drop modulation schemes. As you drop modulation schemes, you lose a spectral efficiency. When you lose a spectrum efficiency, you're not transmitting things as well. You need to introduce more error correction. You need to introduce repetition. And yes, you're transmitting the whole time, but you're not transmitting your data necessarily the whole time, okay? So that's why you want to be closer to the cell. So for 3 megahertz FDD, you have 15 resource blocks to work with. If you're not very familiar with LTE, that's a little bit kind of technical, but you will see that when we go to 5 megahertz and to 10 megahertz, you have more resource blocks. Resource blocks is how the LTE group subcarriers for the transmission of data. Okay, so and I say I have 15 resource blocks to work with, that's how much transmit blocks I have for data. Trying to simplify that. Examples of applications. Distribution automation, it's a good example. Why? Because this band covers a reasonably good area. It's still 900 megahertz has a good coverage. You have a little bit more, 3 megahertz, a little bit more bandwidth. So latency is not an issue anymore like it was in narrowband IoT. So it's a more secure band to do this type of application. But then I got myself, I actually was asked that question. Oh, can I do security cameras? Yes, you can. And then this is what I realized. I now include this slide in my next 2 bands. I include security cameras as one option of application. Why? Because it's important for you to compare as a service or a device. You have multiple tiers of quality that you might want to achieve. If you're putting a few cameras, you only need to see one camera at a time, and you don't need high data rate, high frame rate, you don't need high resolution, you can put a camera in 3 megahertz. Would I, if I'm deploying a camera system, wireless camera system for my customers, would I do that? I would make very, very sure that my customer understands what that would mean. But it's doable. If that's all you have to work with, it is doable, okay? So why am I putting this here? Very important, visualization of one camera at a time. You wouldn't put a video wall with 8 images on a 3 megahertz spectrum to try to see your camera. It's not gonna work. Okay, so that's again, and I'm going to keep hitting on this. For you to select your spectrum, you need to first select what you're trying to achieve with it. What kind of device are you serving? What is the quality that you want? Where are they going to be? What is the throughput? That will allow you to define what spectrum work out better for you. So let's look at the example now. So again, 2 by 2 mile squares. So that's why it filled up the screen more. But I wanted to zoom in for you really to have an idea of what's going on with the site. Now it's an LTE prediction, no MIMO. So I'm not putting any extra MIMO spatial multiplexing, no sort of MIMO whatsoever. 1 by 1 antenna, same site, same endpoints. But I'm looking at the RSRP prediction. Why am I highlighting RSRP? That's another common misconception when it comes to LTE. When anybody's measuring anything for you in LTE that related with propagation and related with prediction, you don't want RSSI value. RSSI values are measured in your whole LTE channel. So that would be your whole 3 megahertz in this case. If you go on the same place, let's say even a carrier, if you're doing a drive test and you measure downtown Mobile right now, your RSSI is going to be really high. And then if you come at 3 a.m. in the morning and you drive test the same place, your RSSI is going to be really low, because RSSI includes all your pilot channels or your reference signals and all your traffic channels added up together. So if there's a lot of people speaking, a lot of data being transmitted, it's high. If it doesn't have a lot of data being transmitted, it's low. So RSSI, it's kind of meaningless in terms of a prediction, because you don't know how much traffic you have. So you can't extract that from the picture. So you need to focus on RSRP. RSRP is the reference signal received power. Okay, so that's in essence the pilot channel of LTE. And when you're looking at our RSRP, I am considering here a booster, the 2.5 dB booster, that it's kind of optional on the standard, but most vendors implement that. So this prediction, what it's telling me is my pilot channel covers this area. So I could have users anywhere on that area, and those users could connect and talk to my system. Now, is that my service area? And now I love this answer. It depends. It depends where your users are and how full your cell is. Because if you have a gazillion users right on the red there, you're not going to be able to fit users on the edge of the cell. So your pilot goes there, but you don't have space. You're full. So it is very important in LTE to understand that just the coverage itself doesn't, of the reference signal, doesn't mean that you can get that far, because your cell will get full and then you just cannot go farther, because remember, the farther the users are, the more traffic or the more capacity of the cell they're going to use. So if you're talking a user, let's say 256 QAM modulation close to the cell, and the same identical device on the edge of the cell on QPSK modulation, the QPSK device is using 4 times more capacity on the cell than the 256 QAM devices. So one 256 QAM devices, one QPSK corresponds to 456 QAM, 256, devices. So again, it's very important to keep in mind where your devices are. Is that my service area? It could be, but it could be less than that. It's not going to be more than that, because then I'm limited by my pilot. Okay, so that's why I had to pick something to compare, and I picked the pilot. So the pilot will go, you can go as far as this. Okay. Then you have a mid-band spectrum example. So that's my 1.6 gigahertz. For mid-band, then I have now 5 megahertz, and the first time we're listening to hearing this word TDD. And that's another differential of this band. Not just it has the 5 megahertz, but it has the capability of doing TDD. Why would be the TDD and the FDD capability important? So when you're talking about an FDD spectrum, what that means is that your downlink and your uplink will always have the same size. It's a fixed pair spectrum. So when you're actually talking about, oh, I use this frequency, you usually just mention one of them because the other, it goes together. It's fixed pair spectrum. So your downlink bandwidth is identical to your uplink bandwidth. Now, if you have uplink heavy applications, a TDD system, it starts being a little more interesting because you go like, oh, I can get my band and I can throw more for my uplink than my downlink. I want to analyze that. Now, again, caveat here. You can't pick and choose for each device you're doing this. You do this, you're doing this for your whole network. So you can't say like, oh, when I talk to DA, I want to be more uplink heavy, but then when I talk to something else, no. You change the ratio, you change the ratio to your network. So you have to be careful in the sense that if you're making it an uplink heavy network, the devices you're going to put on that network, they're going to be uplink heavy too, okay? So the TDD formats make it well suited when you have this non-balanced uplink downlink. This band has a good balance between coverage and capacity because you have 5 megahertz, you have the TDD, and you're not as high in spectrum that you die really soon. So you still can propagate a certain distance. Not as far as the 900 band, definitely not as far as the 700 band, but also not as little as a 3.5, okay? So again, depending on where your users are, it might be interesting. Remember my previous slide, I said the 900, you can go big here, but if all your users are in the center by the cell, you're not gonna be able to serve anybody out here anyway. So a situation where your users, and I said this somewhere in there, are concentrated close to the cell. That's a good band to use. Another thing that's important in this band, and also on the 900 band, I forgot to mention that, I apologize, it supports fixed and mobile applications. So 900, 1.6, and the next one, 3.5, they all support fixed and mobile applications. But here I'm going to put a very big disclaimer. I've been talking about devices and the location of devices since I started this presentation. And then I ask you, where are your mobile devices? I don't know. That's the problem, you don't. So when you do your design considering fixed devices, you know where they are. You can plan the capacity. You can say like, this cell will fit these devices. I know it. I did analysis. I know how. And then a mobile device goes in there. Now what's going to happen? If there's space in your cell, nothing. If there isn't, something's got to give, okay? So when you introduce mobility in a fixed system, you have to be a lot more careful in your capacity planning because you are a mission critical network and not a best effort network. You gotta think that that mobile device has the capacity of coming into any cell under the worst possible conditions, which would be on the edge of a cell where there's overlap between coverage for like neighboring cells. It could happen. You're mission critical. You're not, if you're best effort, you're not gonna say like, on average, I'll be good. You can't say that. So you have to pre-plan for the mobility factor, okay? So that's my only caveat every time I say mobile with fixed together. This band also has, for fixed unit, not for mobile units, capacity of, it allows more power, transmit power. So if you have an uplink heavy network, you have fixed users, a lot of time being able to transmit with the extra power can put you on better transmit conditions. so you can get a better modulation scheme on the uplink and impact less on cell capacity. So that's another important thing. Peak data rate. TDD, now we have 25 resource blocks to work with. Remember, we had 15 on 900. We have 25 now because 5 megahertz TDD. With LTE, I put there 4G and 5G. Again, no MIMO on the peak throughput. There's quite a difference you see between the 4G and the 5G. Why is that? LTE has what we call fixed frame formats for the TDD uplink and downlink distribution. So when your TDD ratio, you go like, oh, 80%, so 80% down or 80% up, right? And then 20% on the other one. For LTE and 5G, it's really the format of the subframes. So you have a big frame that lasts a certain transmission period, and then you say that big frame will be transmitted in subframes, and I'm going to use, let's say, 6 uplink subframes. And then I'm going to use 1 special subframe, control and managing everybody. And then I'm going to use 2 downlink subframes, okay? On my example here, I use for frame format 0 for the 4G. So you see that it's actually kind of close, a little bit more on the uplink, but it's kind of close to the megabits per second of the 900. Why is that? Because the frame 0, it's about 75% uplink, 5 megahertz, 3 megahertz, it's more or less the same thing. But when you go to 5G, 5G is much more flexible in terms of the formats that, subframes that it has. So I chose frame format 34, which is a common one. It's not all for the uplink, but most uplink. That gives you a much higher throughput on the uplink. So you have an uplink heavy application. So some applications here, you could do direct AMI, or more common, the AMI backhaul. So you have like concentrators, and then you use those concentrators. And then I put the security camera just because of that comparison we had kind of going on. Low flame rate, low resolution, but now you can see a few cameras at a time. Okay, so that's giving you that little bit boost in terms of how much simultaneous transmissions. Mid-band spectrum again, so this would be, you see the coverage shrinks a little, of course, higher frequency band. Ideal if you can be close to the tower, because then you're kind of holding that interference too. So if you're gonna need a bunch of towers anyway, because your distribution of devices is very dense, then how far you cover is not the problem, right? You need to have the capacity. Now, if your devices are distributed and you have to cover far, then that's a different story. So again, you need to know where devices are. And then last one, Bob, and I'll hand it off to you. Sorry, I'm going a little over. I'm very passionate about this. I get excited, I start talking. CBRS 3.5 gigahertz. Now, you could have more than 10, but 10 is kind of guaranteed that you're going to get at least that if you get one CBRS channel. 10 megahertz TDD, okay? So now, again, if you have a higher density of users and they're close to your site, it's an ideal band for that because you're trying to get on capacity. High peak throughput for throughput intensive applications. TDD format, again, it's well suited for not symmetrical links. Limited coverage area, but 10 megahertz gives you more capacity. Potential to use multiple channels if available. So in certain areas, you could have 2, 3 CBRS channels available. Same consideration of fixed and mobile applications. It's doable, but it's even harder to plan for that one. So you just have to be careful. Peak data rate, now you have 50 resource blocks to work with. So I did the same comparison, same frame format. So I'm trying to make it easier to compare the bands. And then some example of applications. So you see throughput hungry applications. I'm so sorry. Throughput hungry applications. Virtual reality live feed applications. Going to the camera now you can do high frame rate. You can do high resolution. You can visualize several cameras at a time. So going back to my security guard that is sitting there and looking at the 8 cameras with all the different shots and facial recognition, yeah, you can do that here, not on the other ones. Okay, so you have to be always cognizant of what you're trying to do. And then I put one last bullet like there, indoor coverage extenders. And that's something that this band is actually kind of known for a little bit. When you're transmitting 3.5, you have a tower outdoor, and you're transmitting, and you say like, oh, it has no indoor penetration, it's terrible. That means that if you're transmitting indoor, it actually doesn't go out, or very little. So it's perfect for signal boosters indoors environment because it doesn't interfere with the outdoor world. So it's very common that even carriers will use this band or will negotiate this band for like shopping malls or even stadium arenas to use that as a booster for signal. So I think that was my last slide. Yeah, so that's just showing that the prediction shrinks significantly. But again, if you're targeting to use this band, you're going for the capacity, you're not going for the coverage of the band. Any questions? I think I'm done. Any questions about my part? Or we can also answer questions later. Okay, go.
Not a question, just a quick update. I was saying here.
Okay, oh, thank you.
So the 3x3 is approved for 5G. So
Perfect.
And Anterix, in conjunction with some utilities and some associations, has petitioned the FCC to take the 3x3 to a 5x5. That's in front of the FCC. Just
thank you.
out there,
Thank you. I actually, I was looking to see if he had been approved by the 3GPP yet, and I couldn't, I didn't. Perfect. Thank you. John.
I was just going to comment on
Uh-huh.
something that people often don't understand when they look at spectrum. They see it only if it's wide. They think, well, the narrowband rate is follow this, therefore I should be able to put 5 channels.
No.
Get to look at is the FCC emission limits at the band edge, and it depends on what type of radio system you use and how close to the band edge.
Yes, thank you. I put 1 or more channels, but because exactly I didn't, but thank you for that. Yes, that is a very good thing to highlight. Any other questions? Randy?
Have you seen, heard of any?
So that would be, actually, that's a very good question, Randy. I know utilities a lot of times already have hard time getting 1 spectrum band, but depending on what you're trying to, Bob is just smiling here next to me, but depending on what you're trying to achieve, rather than trying to overburden 1 band and have a system that doesn't perform exactly how you expected it to perform, a good compromise, if you have the way of doing it, is to separate things in more than 1 band. So now you can have a 4G system or a 5G system and use dual band. I think you presented on that once. You call it duet. See, good memory. So you can have dual bands, and then you can choose for every device that you're putting in your network what band would be more suitable. So that would be a good way of addressing multiple devices requirements. Anything else? Nope. Oh, yes.
So thank you for coming today. It's good to see good turnout here. As I look around the audience, I see a number of parties that already hold spectrum, both the users and we have some other parties that are selling spectrum. And really, I'm talking sort of about today about the inventory, about some pluses and minuses. You see here, Christine talked about the 4 bands that I think are most prevalent among private network and compatible with 4G and 5G standards, right? So there's a block here. And then I'll call them bands to watch. There's another 4 that are at least considering, entering this space. There's parties that hold these licenses. They're thinking about whether they would like to get in, or there's parties that want to hold these licenses and might bring them to this market. So I'll focus mostly on the bands that are out there and available now, try to go through some of the pluses and minuses, kind of considering some of the factors that Christine spoke about, and then some of the intrigue for those of us who are spectrum wonks as kind of what's going to happen with these other bands to watch. I'll entertain that. For my presentation, I'd say we have 18 minutes, and I didn't know, that's fine, but I'd encourage it to be interactive. So since we have a number of experts in this room, if I say something that you disagree with or thinks it needs enhancing, understanding that we don't have it forever, I think it would be good to speak up and offer your comments. So feel free to raise a hand, shout at me, whatever you think. So the 4 bands here that I'm mentioning, first of all, the upper 700 megahertz A block. So it is in the 4G and 5G standards. It is also unique in the sense that it's already held by critical infrastructure and utility companies covering about 1/3 of the US. It has had a couple dozen sales to entities of that sort over the last 9 years, I think. So many of you are familiar with it, and some of you, utilities, I see at least one here and probably more, that already hold these licenses. So that's great. Now that it's in the 4G standards, worth talking about for additional applications, right? There are traditional radio, by the way, we're doing a talk on applications and traditional versus 4G, 5G networks tomorrow at 9:40 a.m., I believe. So if you're interested in that comparison, please come back and discuss that as well. But this is just looking at the NB-IoT solution. As Christine said, slower speeds, very much longer range, but the scale on the 2 different maps was different by a factor of 5, right? So you're talking about 2 sites covering the entire Phoenix area, I think you said, or Jacksonville. We had the same kind of situation. And very tolerant to any kind of interference, range, propagation issues. So that's 700. We have the 900 megahertz band 106 now. Mike is here from Anterix and can tell you all about it. Has had good success. I think we have 6, something like that, utilities who have stepped up to acquire rights, either sales or leases to this band. Certainly good propagation. The channel width is limited, and although there is a proceeding that could expand that. There's relocation of existing licenses, which could take some time. This is why I said the availability is limited but increasing. Both of these bands, I guess we should say, and something that has been introduced in particular by one of our prospective new entrants, are in comparatively noisy environments, right? There's a lot of existing operations in these bands. So that's a contrast to band 54, 1670 megahertz band. Christine also spoke about it. Excellent propagation, not as good as 900. You can compensate for that with very high power limits. The power limits are 2,000 watts. Typically, you're not ever going to likely use that in a fixed uplink type environment, or mobile uplink type environment. But it's really allows that ability to boost the transmit power to effectively, I would say, make up for the difference in propagation. You have obviously the advantages of, I think TDD is an advantage. Other people may feel differently, but particularly for utilities where it allows you to match whatever your ratio is of uplink and downlink. And typically it'll be more uplink than downlink. So you can use all of the spectrum and not have any of it go to waste. Available nationwide today. And we are looking to negotiate transactions. So please see us. There is, we'll be honest, not the same ecosystem today. That's something we're working very hard on. And we'll certainly be glad to talk to you about that. And this operates in an environment far away from typical commercial operations and therefore has a lower noise floor. So in your engineering, this was not so much about interference today, but besides propagation, besides throughput and latency, you also have to look at the noise floor, and you'll find a very good story in that case. And then priority access licenses for PALs. It's a different general environment, right? There's a spectrum availability or spectrum access system database that tracks all of the usage of these licenses. You can use them in general for free, provided there's available capacity, but you don't have any significant protection from other users. It's a complicated environment where they're looking at transmit powers and other antennas. When you get a PAL, you would have the right to be protected from that, from being squeezed, I guess, in terms of your license operations. And those have been acquired by a number of utilities. Southern California Edison comes to mind. Southern Company has acquired priority access licenses as well. This availability, I'd say, is good. We are representing a variety of different license holders who are willing to sell or lease these licenses. I can't guarantee that you could get it in every, you probably get it in Manhattan would be difficult. Get it in Mobile, there's a good chance that you could get a priority access license or a city like Mobile. And the noise floor I call relatively good. So stop there in terms of the initial 4 bands. I know we've got holders in these bands. Anyone care to offer a comment, suggestion? Okay. Some people are, as I said, the spectrum wonks are a little bit more interested in what's coming. So 600, in terms of 600 megahertz, we've had a transaction in this band. So this band was auctioned a number of years ago. It used to be for television channels. This used to be the UHF channels at the top of your old television screen or television switcher. There was a two-way auction. The FCC reacquired these licenses from the high television bands, made them available for broadband. It's been heavily acquired by T-Mobile, and they have substantial operations in this space. Dish also holds licenses in these bands. And in some places, this was acquired by investors. So at 4 o'clock today, I'm going to have a session with Tanner, I forget Tanner's last name, from Grain Management. And he's going to talk about the 600 megahertz licenses that they held. Memphis Light and Power, I think, brought from Charlie Townsend. Blue Water 2, I think, was the name of that investor entity. Relatively high price that they paid, but certainly used widely by carriers. There's excellent propagation, better than anything we've seen here at 600 megahertz, slightly better than the 700. 5+5 megahertz, so lots of capacity in terms of a utility environment. That's not a lot in the carrier world, but in the utility environment. So we would say certainly good throughput, would penetrate well into buildings. A pretty interesting band, but mostly not available, right? And even where the investors hold it, in general, they've been reluctant to consider selling it. So we'll see how that goes. They think they're going to get more from somebody else. This is my speculation. Unfortunately, I don't hold any of those licenses, so I can't speak for that. But that's the historical way that investors made money is they went into the auction, they got a discount because they were not a big operating entity. not a big discount, but like 25%. They bought it, they held it for a while, and then AT&T or Verizon or T-Mobile came knocking on the door. This one, I'm a little more skeptical. And, so we have seen a demonstration in this band by NIPA. That was a temporary lease. And then this transaction. And we have Grain Management is now a UTC member. So this is, a sign of some interest.
So it's a limited number.
Yeah. It's maybe a dozen or fewer investors, and they hold licenses, I would say, in something like 25% of the POPs of the country. So in most cases, this will not be an answer for your utility. In some cases, it may be, it's a very specialized case. So the 800 megahertz band 26, is the one that people have been reading about. This is held by T-Mobile. Dish had an option to purchase this for $3.6 billion. It's 14 megahertz. I think that works out to like 80 cents per megahertz pop, something like that, nationwide. It's been historically used, so this was the old Nextel band. Southern Company has licenses in this band. There's plenty of equipment out there, good propagation, good power limits. So potentially a very good band. We're going to see what happens. The Dish did not exercise their option. Their option expired as part of the merger between T-Mobile and Sprint. The Department of Justice required T-Mobile to sell the auction or to sell the licenses, provided they get $3.6 billion. And there's some additional nuances so that process, I understand, is underway. It's all under non-disclosure. I'm not I've not been part of that. My company has not been part of that. But we're going to see what I think T-Mobile said they have interest. They expect it to go reasonably well. I personally am skeptical. Burns & McDonnell has announced that they potentially would acquire, as part of the Burns & McDonnell group, which I understand could include utilities or other entities who are clients of Burns & McDonnell, that they might acquire the spectrum. So ask your friends at Burns & McDonnell. They might be able to tell you more than I can. If it is acquired at a price along those lines, it's a pretty major investment that they've put forward. And we'll have to see how that affects how the company operates and that kind of thing. Yes, Randy.
Well, this is probably more opinion than anything else. Correct. Do you sense that there's been any softening other than fourth national
I think in the details of the auction, T-Mobile's not required to sell it to AT&T or Verizon, right? So it kind of and Dish didn't have the money, so we're out of the big four, right? It's unless they choose to sell it to T-Mobile or Verizon, and I think I'm sorry, unless they choose to sell it to AT&T or Verizon. So that would be an interesting discussion between the parties, but it sort of has to go outside of that sphere if it's according to the auction rules or the Department of Justice rules. So this is a big mystery. This is a $3.6 billion kind of a mystery. That's what going to happen here.
Would they be willing to hold a note?
Pat is in the business of loaning money, just in case anybody wants to know, or at least he's experienced with that. Okay, so the last thing I want to mention is that the 2.4 gigahertz band, Global Star holds these licenses. It's 11 megahertz. It's been available. It's been used in some ports. Nokia makes equipment for this band. It has, originally this was called TLPS, Terrestrial Low Power Service. So like CBRS, it has much more limited power. And obviously it's at a higher frequency. In my opinion, this is a competitor to CBRS in the sense of lots of throughput, relatively small coverage area. I think you could cover a substation with this. Apparently you can cover ports with it because that's in the works in some places. I don't think this is competitive with most of the other bands we've talked about where potentially a utility could cover an entire region. Personal view, and certainly willing to look at engineering, and maybe I'll be proven otherwise. All right, we have 4 minutes for questions or comments or suggestions.